almost identical, right? And you're going to see the different position of the arm in volleyball because we have to actually go upwards. But you're still getting almost all of the same things. And again, that's an efficient volleyball swing. Again, when kids haven't thrown, actually they use, when they're training little kids to pitch, they'll use fastball throwing as a way to train the kinetic chain, because without even saying it, kids will tend to use their lower half a lot more when they're trying to throw hard. So that's another way in which you guys can train, and Chris and I can talk about that later on, but just the throwing motion in general trains the kinetic chain, or as you put it, right, the game kind of teaches the game. So this skill, the skill of throwing, can teach the skill of hitting if you do it enough and frequently enough. And on the opposite side, again, if the kinetic chain is poor, right, in the example that we're forcing the limb forward, just a lot of joint load, right? And so to get away from high amounts of joint load, we have to use the torso. We got to use the big pieces of the body to create the force. So again, the torso, that's our primary force generator, especially for us as volleyball athletes, because we don't have the ground anymore underneath us. We have to use the body efficiently when we're going into the air. And so what a lot of people get kind of wrong with the volleyball spike is a lot of them will say, okay, you have to open your feet and you have to rotate everything at once. But again, we know that the sequencing part matters a lot. We also know that foot position is highly individual. So when you tell kids to do something in a very particular fashion, sometimes what it does is it messes up their natural self-organizing process. If you talk too much, sometimes that can mess up their natural self-organizing process. And we're going to get into some of those things a little bit later, but it's important to understand that when we're going through these things with the athletes, kind of allowing them to learn and discover on their own, and then kind of nudging them in ways that we want, right? And so again, if we're talking about swinging really hard, instead of saying, hey, rotate as fast as you can say, hey, show me how to hit the ball harder. And then you see what they do. So if they do a flexion extension, you say, hey, how about you open to me and then close to the net or something like that. But just to reiterate, the torso is our primary energy source. The hips are not the energy source, right? So a lot of people will tell you, oh, the power's in your hips. We're in the air. That's not going to give you anything, right? So the torso is really the engine of the body when we're off of the ground. So just to make sure that's clear. You can kind of see it here. A lot of the Brazilians do a very, very good job of utilizing the torso. So again, we know that it's extremely important in the overhead throwing motion and the spike. So again, when you're having your kids warm up, they can do drills in which they're, doing side tosses. You can have them actually feeling what it's like to move that torso around, so they have a better idea of how to move it in space.
Do you think that, like an example like the Brazilians, they have so many more kids that just naturally play the sport of volleyball growing up, like over a clothesline? And that's kind of why they do, like what?
They're on the
why
beach.
Do they kind of,
they're on the beach a lot.
More?
The other part is that interestingly, I talked to a coach from Brazil, and a lot of the stuff that in America we would have said, oh, that's wrong, like a goofy-footed approach or whatever, they actually consider that someone's natural athleticism, which is an interesting way to think about it, right? And so what actually ends up happening there versus here is they're not so driven towards some particular technique, that what ends up actually happening is the athletes kind of organize towards some of the more optimal biomechanics principles, which is kind of crazy. So you can see how, in that example, us as coaching giving cues to someone can have a huge impact on what they're doing in their body. And so it's really important to know the cue that you're giving, how it's going to affect them, what actually you're trying to get out of the motion. So one of the ones that drives me crazy is the term high elbow, right? And so, I guess I can see why somebody needs to get their elbow high at some point in time. But if we're trying to actually promote a better arm cocking phase, I'm not going to tell someone, get your elbow up here, right? As we saw in the slide earlier, this is a really poor position for the arm to be in if I'm trying to create force, as well as for those forces to be transmitted through the joint. So this is my lever arm, right? Lever arms are supposed to be perpendicular to the axis of rotation, which is your spine, right? So I want the arm to be level with my spine during the cocking phase. That's what allows me to open my torso and utilize my torso. So anytime you tell someone get their elbow high, not that everyone will do it, but kids will tend to go like, just to try to get the cue down, right? And then all of a sudden they're in a terrible position to spike, right? So that's something that you want to kind of watch out for. Again, just to reiterate the point, if you don't use your torso efficiently, there's just more force on the shoulder joint, right? And so there's a lot of slap tears and shoulder injuries in volleyball now. Injuries, they still don't know why exactly this is happening. Sometimes there's things that we don't even think about. There's stress, there's sleep, there's diet, there's all kinds of different aspects that can contribute to injury. But there's large correlational stuff, right? Like position of the shoulder joint before external rotation. So all of those things you kind of gotta watch out for. So then we talk about hip shoulder separation. Basically, we were talking earlier about disassociating the hips and the torso, right? So when you do that, anytime we disassociate, we stretch the muscles of the torso, and more specifically, they're called the obliques, right? The obliques are really the energy source of the torso. So as we separate, right, those muscles load like rubber bands, that gives us potential energy. That energy then we take and we utilize to move the arm quicker, right? So here it is again, right? You can see how the torso is open but the hips are closed. And this is a higher level skill, right? Not a lot of athletes are really, really great at creating hip and shoulder separation unless they've gone through this stuff for a long time. So this is one of the better outside hitters in the world from Serbia. It's a nice example of it, right? You can see how far the elbow is near her spine at this point, right? The pelvis is forward, torso's way open. So it's also important to understand that thoracic mobility is vital to the swing or the overhead throw. So hopefully at some point in time, you guys can have the kids go through like a movement screen. You can have a physical therapist go through them, because if they have limits in thoracic mobility, that's going to affect their ability to produce force, as well as increasing their chances for injury. So if I can't rotate my thoracic region very well, I can't utilize my torso that well. And so again, those forces are going to be at the shoulder joint. So those things are kind of important. Do you guys do any kind of screening at all? It might be good to have.
We could. I know somebody who would easily come and do that.
Yeah, and to take a look at, and we'll get to the scapula in a little bit, but how the scapula and the humerus moves is vital for force transfer, everyone, right? So every little inch that you get can increase arm speed. Hopefully that's clear kind of at this point. So now we'll get into the scapula. So that's where, again, the humerus and the scapula articulate together at the glenoid cavity, or the glenohumeral joint. This is a ball and socket joint. It's the most movable joint in the body. And again, those two structures, right, they work together. If they don't work together properly, you're gonna have pain, you're gonna have increased chance for injury and poor performance. So that's, again, going back to having them be screened, before they start. And then if some of them have either imbalances or strength issues, they can actually start doing those things. And maybe that can even be part of the warm-up where you're going through, a lot of scapula and shoulder work, because it's really, really important for us. I did not do this enough, and I probably have most likely a torn labrum and possibly maybe a torn infraspinatus. That's one of the external rotators, right? The ones that are responsible for slowing the arm down. So if I would have known that when I was younger, I would have done a much better job. But it seems as though, I'm sure most of you kind of know, like, some of these things are super important, but having the kids do it when they're here kind of forces them to do it, which is kind of good. So again, we don't have to really go through this too much. Just understand that the scapula needs to be positioned in a very particular way during different phases of the swing or the overhead throw. This position is vital. So when we are going through the swing and just the throw in general, full scapular retraction is important because that's what is allowing those forces to be dissipated through the joint correctly. And retraction is when the scapula kind of slides back towards your spine, right? And that is not necessarily an active motion. It happens sort of naturally. So it slides backwards across your thorax, and then it sticks in place as the shoulder is going into external rotation. And the scapula will then upwardly rotate. And then as you go into acceleration, the scapula actually protracts away from the thorax. So again, those movements of the scapula.
Would you
are
train
vital.
that somehow though? Cause I'm thinking about like my golf swing.
Mm.
And like if you have rounded shoulders,
Mhm.
you have limited range of mobility, right?
Yep.
But as soon as I go into scapular retraction,
Yep.
now my swing is really, really free to go way back here and go all the way through.
Totally, because now you're actually getting retraction and protraction.
Right.
Right. So you can train those, but like I said, the movements train the movements.
Yeah.
So if you're having your kids go through throwing exercises, that will usually naturally happen. Other people that do more strength and conditioning stuff will kind of isolate. They'll do exercises where they have a kid that's kind of sits on the edge of a bench, and they'll be having like some sort of dumbbell or a weighted ball, and so they actually have to sort of feel what retraction and protraction are like.
But also your wristband thing, if you can
Yeah.
get them to put that wristband
Yeah.
in a certain position, they're
Exactly.
just automatically gonna retract.
Exactly, and then again, you can even have them when you're doing warm-ups.
Yeah, that's what I was
Right, you
thinking.
can
like,
go,
yeah.
you can have them, okay, reach towards the sky, and they have to protract, right? And that's the serratus anterior that's doing that motion. The serratus anterior is an upward rotator. Hitters and throwers lose upward rotation of the scapula throughout a season because all of the muscles start to get tighter and tighter. That's usually what ends up causing injury when you start to lose range of motion because now the forces aren't dissipated correctly. So making sure that the serratus anterior stays strong throughout the season, external rotators stay strong throughout the season, really important to avoid injury. Another one that you can do are kind of like wall slides. You guys do wall slides? So like sometimes you can put a band across your arms and you do slides like this where they're actually having to utilize some of those scapular muscles. But if you have somebody that is a physical therapist, he can give you a program, or he or she can give you a program that the kids can follow, you know. So going back to scapular protraction, that's very important at contact. That actually gives me a higher contact point, lengthens my lever, right? And that is a very important motion for the scapula to stay in contact with the humerus. If I can't fully protract, basically the humerus wants to kind of pull away from that joint. And that's where you get kind of that incorrect force transfer. So you'll see it again, universal position, right? So if you're seeing in your hitters when you're doing slow motion, I really stress using slow motion sometimes, right? So say on days that you kind of want to focus a little bit more on technique, when you're going through this and you see a hitter that's in this position, not a great position to be in, right? And so most of the time they're not they either don't have a pattern for getting it back down or something else is happening. So we'll get into some of the skill acquisition stuff, but using objects that they need to put in a certain place is beneficial, and we'll kind of show that in a little bit. But getting them to get into that position is important. But again, you don't even have to say that stuff if you guys start training them to throw at a young age. A lot of this stuff comes naturally because the body sort of knows the best positions. Your central nervous system won't allow your arm to be in certain positions because you'll get injured. So again, just to reiterate the point, if you can't get into that position, there's really increased stress on the anterior structures. Because again, what actually ends up happening is if you can't get the full retraction of the scapula, basically the humerus wants to start to pull away from the joint, right? That pulling away of the joint ends up putting pressure on the anterior capsule of the shoulder joint, which again is really not great. So major takeaways: energy is transferred near to far, right? Pelvis, torso, arm. And in volleyball, a lot of people want to talk about, okay, you have to rotate your hips. In my experience, as well as if you look at some of the literature in baseball pitching, rotation of the pelvis or the pelvic angular velocity is actually not that important. It's really the torso. So there are still professionals who have goofy footed approaches at the highest levels in the world. Then why can they hit so hard? Why can they still perform at a high level? Well, it has nothing to do with your hips, right? It has everything to do with whether or not you can utilize your torso. So that's an important one. But again, anytime you're training, it's a good thing to train from a near to far sequence. So if you see someone that's standing there and forcing it from their shoulder, you know there's something wrong and you have to kind of help them along. You know that the torso is important. Inefficient kinetic change, put more force on the shoulder joint. And 90 degrees is a good one to have. Now again, everyone is different. They've done studies on baseball pitchers in the majors, and some of them are at 95, some are at 100 degrees, because that's actually the most beneficial for their joint. Sometimes the joints are slightly different in different places. And so just make sure that, you know, if they're somewhere near 90, that's pretty good. Anything super excessive, that's probably when you actually want to help them out.
That's as they're cocking or loading or turning.
Exactly. So if they're up here, most of the time, they'll never even get open.
Yeah, but as you come through, you want them to get out.
Exactly. But that becomes the problem, right? Where if you don't understand the phases of the swing, somebody that doesn't understand the arm cocking phase gives a cue of high elbow, and then all of a sudden they
It's
never
the wrong
get.
time,
It's the wrong time, exactly. Okay, so now we'll break down the approach and the spike. Approach is first. These are more parameters, kind of a slow to fast. I'm sure all you guys kind of know that. I tend to use, and when you look at high levels, the second step is a big one. So I could care less how many steps someone takes, but when they take their load step, or the step right before the big powerful step close, when, where, and how they take it is really, really vital. So when you see kids running, oftentimes they don't even emphasize their step close. Oftentimes they can't make adjustments. So when you really, really emphasize that just the last two steps matter, oftentimes, kind of like in our last session with your daughter, you can see what actually ends up happening, right? So in the last session when we were working together, we were focusing on the step close and the mechanics of the step close. And as we actually got more relaxed and we got the torso involved, that ends up being almost everything. So a lot of the time, and we'll get into that in a second, but the mechanics of the step close are vital. If you don't understand how to utilize the torso and to utilize your arms and how those things actually synchronize, your athletes won't get optimized. I can trust me on that one. So all of these people from around the world come and work with me and they're like, oh, I want to work on my mechanics. I'm like, okay. And the first thing I look at is their last two steps. If their last two steps are inefficient, it's not even worth the time to work on their mechanics, because their step close mechanics will tell me how much time we have to actually go through proper arm swing mechanics. So just understand that the step close is super vital, and we're going to go through some of those points now. This is Jordan Larson from the national team. So you can see again, she's taking a three-step approach. Those last two are the most important ones, right? That's all she's got. And of course, these are the best athletes in the world, right? But that does not mean that kids at lower levels should not be doing this stuff, right? These are the principles of good movement. So all of the literature, right, orientation, step length, right, the distance of it can matter. It's not always the most important. Use of the counter movement jump, right, so coming down and then coming back up, something that happens usually naturally. Torso flexion's a big one, right? So when we were working together in our last session, and I should pull that up maybe at the end. But
You have it on your iPad?
yeah,
Is it in there?
no, I haven't.
Oh, okay.
I can put it up in a little bit. But basically she started almost completely vertical going into her step close, right? And you have all this force, right, trying to get her to jump, and she's not using the most important part, the biggest segment of the body, the torso. And once we had her start to flex forward, not only do you start to see a much more efficient jump mechanics, but then your arms get utilized. Your arms go through way more range of motion, and that is just from tilting your torso forward. And again, that's been identified in the literature. So again, that ties directly into a wide dynamic arm swing.
And when we did that, just super simply, we just put a piece of medical tape, or like a sports tape, across Kinsley's chest, and just said, when you go in, we just want you to feel like you're getting that tape more to the floor versus, and that's all we did. And then she started flexing forward more and more until she got more used to it, and then it was a complete, a night and day change in like 5 minutes.
Yeah. And we'll get into the cueing and some of that stuff in a little bit. So this is a study by this guy, Sebastian Fuchs. So again, this is kind of what they should look like, right? So you can see that one line, that curved line that's going across, that's what the body should end up doing, right, is dropping. The center of mass should drop and come back up. In the second skeleton, you can see how far the foot is in front of the head. That's another big one, right? So when we're looking for distance of that orientation step, the heel should be well in front of their face. On a good set, in a good situation, that's what you're looking for. So if you see someone shorting that step, you already know what's gonna happen after that. They're usually gonna have a giant fourth step, and they're usually gonna end up broad jumping. So when they have a giant fourth step, which is you're gonna see in a second, that's poor energy transfer, and then all of that energy is gonna wanna go forward versus up, depending on where the set is. So this is kind of a nice example of it here. So that's something we talk about a lot, rolling on the left foot. Arms are down. You're gonna see a lot of people in the zombie walk position. So again, pretty efficient here. Huge backswing, torso's tilted forward, heels way in front. And the pendulum motion of the arms, again, is very, very important, right? That's another really important reference point right there. So let's go back to some of these. So this is one of the major reference points for the double arm lift. So the lead heel is on the ground at the peak of hyperextension. If you see someone where the arms are coming down, which I'll show you in a little bit, you know that there's inefficient force transfer. And as we move forward, right, this pendulum action, so in a pendulum, when a pendulum is moving fastest, is right at perpendicular to the ground. So in a pendulum motion of the arms, right, we want both feet to be down when the arms are perpendicular, because that's where the forces are greatest. So the arms actually kind of tug you down just a little bit more. And there's multiple studies on the benefits of the arm swing, but there's one done on professional volleyball players, men in the Czech league, in the Czech first league. And it accounted for 38% of their jump. 38%, that's almost half, right? So when you see someone that's not utilizing the arms correctly, that's a big portion of where you can make big gains. And you're gonna see that today even with her. How did it feel? Different, right? And so when you can give someone just the sense of like heaviness in their arms and that pendulum motion, can make a huge, huge difference. But again, the only way we get a great pendulum action and to get a lot of range of motion is a forward tilt. If they're not forward tilting the torso, they're not gonna get it. So a hip hinge is another principle of good human movement, being able to actually hinge forward and keeping the spine in a neutral position. A lot of times you'll see people crumble, right? Because they're not using their erectors to keep themselves in that neutral spine position. And that's the study that we had just talked about. So same thing, right? We know, if we know where the principles are with a proper counter movement jump and how the arms are being utilized, then we can see them, we can identify them in training, and then we can try to make adjustments. So let's get into the spike now. So we got basically 5 phases: wind up, arm cocking, acceleration, deceleration, and follow through. And we're going to be going through those things now. So during the wind up and arm cocking phase, this is where, again, there's going to be a huge amount of individual variation. I am not, when I train people, I'm not trying to make everyone the same. That's a lot, what a lot of people think that I do. It's like, or they think that I'm trying to get everyone to have like a roundhouse swing or something like that. What I do is I usually work with an individual's individuality, and then I'll also try different things. So oftentimes, kids don't even have the opportunity to just explore, just to try different things. Like, hey, try to do a roundhouse swing, try to do this, try to do that. And when you give kids a chance, you give them an opportunity to feel something different. And then you can, or they can decide on what kind of fits their bodies, what they can do in the air. And that's really important, because when we're pushing something on athletes, some of them might not even be able to do it. So what's really interesting is in literature, they've actually been able to do a 3D graph of someone's coordination profile. So say someone's throwing. Someone that's a bistable person has 2 peaks and 1 valley. So you drop a marble and it's going to want to fall into that same valley over and over. You have other people that are tri-stable, so they have 2 valleys. You have people that are multi-stable that have a bunch of different valleys. And so a multi-stable person can actually do all kinds of different things. And they can fly in and out of whatever you tell them to do. Whereas someone else, a bistable person, they can't, because they don't even have what they call attractors for it. So how then do you build attractors, right? It's you play different sports, you throw at a young age. When I see people just playing volleyball, I'm like, fuck, that's not great. You're not giving them different movement experiences. They're not understanding how to utilize their body. They're not building other coordination patterns. And so kind of when I usually talk with club directors and owners, I say, hey, you guys are responsible for basically making them movement literate, right? Bring in some tennis rackets, bring in some wiffle balls and tees, and have them hitting off of tees. Learn, what is that going to teach them? It's going to learn how to, they're actually going to learn how to rotate their pelvis and rotate their torso. So there's other things that you can use just besides volleyball and our words to get the kids to do something, right? You can make it a little bit more fun as well. So going back to the wind-up phase, just anything that's moving horizontally is good, because that's going to promote the torso to open up. And it assists in getting hip-shoulder separation. So going back to that cue of high elbow, anytime I see someone flexing really high, usually they're not going to get great hip-shoulder separation. They don't have the weight, they don't have the lever arm moving perpendicular to the line of force.
Your wrench analogy was really good for the kids too.
Yeah, I actually have the video on Instagram, but it's easiest when you can see the example. So if you have a bolt and a wrench, nobody's going to put the wrench like this at an angle. It doesn't make any sense. You can't rotate the bolt, right? Everyone will align it straight. So in our example, the spine is the bolt, right? And our arm is the wrench. So I want to position the arm, again, perpendicular to the bolt. That's how I have the greatest force transfer, right? So some enhancers that can possibly influence more speed, right? So utilizing the non-dominant arm, but again, that is a throwing, that's something that's built in throwing. So if you have the kids that are throwing, this is really interesting. I read this study that was talking about coaching cues during trying to train the non-dominant arm. There was a study where coaches were telling the kids to reach at their target. And the kids that were told that, all of their performance dropped significantly. All of the kids that were not told anything, all of them rose their hand higher. And what do you end up getting? You get more force transfer. So there's another example of us thinking that the cues that we're giving are helping, and yet they can be really, really hurtful for performance.
You're
So-
talking about like bow
Yeah.
and arrow?
Yeah. So
Don't get me started.
usually what I'll say with like just a cue is just reach for the ceiling. That's it. Reach for the ceiling and that's fine. And so at least then we can get some sort of a force transfer. But it's a big one. Utilizing the legs and then changing the motion of the hitting arm, and we're gonna see examples now. So this guy is a multi-stable athlete. I can tell him to do anything and he just does it automatically, which is wild, and you're gonna see that here. So here's the non-dominant arm, right? You can see it going straight up. So we have a, yeah.
Just like Marquetta, you're big on.
And remember,
you're big on that one.
he didn't start like this. So all I said, so with his non-dominant arm, he was pretty good with that. What I was trying to get him was like, okay, hey, let's see if we can utilize your lower body more. He fucking almost kicks
It's like
his
Josie
butt.
back in the day.
Wild, wild, right?
By lifting his feet so high though, he actually is lowering his center of gravity.
You're actually raising it. You're raising the center of mass, and then when you extend it, you actually raise your torso. So in a study on the flexion of the legs, when the legs rapidly flex, so there's this thing called hang time, right? It's not like you break the laws of physics, but when you rapidly extend your legs, it extends your torso. So you're still falling in a parabolic path, but your head, because your torso extends, stays at 0 degrees for just a little bit longer. And again, they've studied this, right? And they're like, this is one of the best things that a hitter can do because at contact, you get just a little bit more time.
So you're saying at the swing, his leg should come back down
They have to.
in an ideal.
They have to, because that's also gonna propel the torso forward. So basically, like, if you could think of
You're just
that
not seeing it
motion,
'cause it's getting cut off.
you could think like, I'll show you in the next one. Basically, if you took a piece of plastic and you bent it, right, you have potential energy. That's kind of what's occurring in the body.
Yeah, he's not, actually hitting the ball, so we don't see the moment of contact, but
And
you're
you
saying
will.
just before the moment of contact, his feet are actually going the other way.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And you'll
Yeah.
see that when we get to contact, and we'll see that in a second. Wait. Okay, here we go. So here's the roundhouse swing, right? Something that was trying to be trained out of kids, right? This is the best outside hitter in the world right now from Brazil, right? So why would this be beneficial? Well, when the arm goes through more range of motion, there's more time for it to pick up speed, right? So you're gaining more velocity. Now, the other really interesting thing, and I'm still trying to wrap my brain around it, is when you look at a lot of these athletes, remember, this is 40%. So this is called a circular extended swing. Not everyone has a circular extended swing, but 40% of athletes are moving the arm in a circular path. The wild part about this swing is that you don't actually go into external rotation that far. And the reason that would be good is because then you don't stress the joint, which is wild. So not only does this produce the most force, but it also is the least impactful on the shoulder joint. That was one of the most wild things that they've actually come to learn and understand.
Is it hard to stay balanced in the air though, if you're?
I mean, it can be. I mean, you see here, she's kind of falling to the left, but the reason that most people will fall to the left and the leg will come up is because when you do a torso lean, that's what's extending your lever. So that's a natural part of the motion. And then when you actually do a tilt, that also pushes the bottom half of your body out, which is why you see so many people doing that. Now,
She's landing on one foot though, that's.
exactly. And so we could go on a whole nother presentation about injury mechanisms. There's a whole social, cultural thing with that as well, right? So here's the other part. If you don't want to have your girls landing on 2 feet, then have them jump goofy footed, right? And then all of a sudden people are like, well, but goofy footed is wrong. Well, show me the evidence, right? So they actually have measured goofy footed people. It's actually more convenient for the rotation of the hips and the pelvis. And what do they do more often? They land on 2 feet. So when you don't know the research, people will often just, it's by opinion, right? I think this because of this. But when you actually look at the evidence, it's not very clear. So, but we'll get to that stuff in a second.
And that's like we were talking about, like Kazanika played with her, like Maddie O, that's playing at Pepperdine now. She's a lefty right side in club, and she was goofy footed, and I did 2 lessons with her, and I just gave up on making her not goofy anymore. And I was like, it actually works pretty good.
Mhm.
If we just maximize, but that would be like not teach everybody that, but with her, I just came to the conclusion of, she does a pretty good job of hammering balls. I can work within the parameters of her goofy footedness and still get her to be a really high level player without, cause she's actually worse trying to put her in my box of what I initially wanted to do with her when I came in the door. She's better off naturally doing what she wants to do and having me show her how to maximize that.
Yeah, and the other interesting part, so in ecological dynamics, human beings are self-organizing systems like nature. And you just have to give them a good environment. And what the overwhelming theory is that when you give someone more movement experiences, they learn more about their body. So what do people come in and do with me? Well, I take them through goofy footed approaches. I take them through regular footed approaches. I take them through all kinds of different shit. Well, why is that? Well, when they're doing it, what are they learning? They're learning how to actually coordinate their body. A person that is forced into a goofy footed approach also then is forced to understand how to counter rotate, right? Some people that don't even know how to rotate their torso open often do so because they never actually rotate it back. They just open up their feet. So when someone just turns their feet, they're in that position. They don't know what this motion is like. So what will I have them do? I'll tell them, okay, go goofy footed. Does that mean that I want them to do that in the game? Not necessarily, but I have people that can do both, and they offer different things. I had a kid that basically plateaued. He wasn't particularly great. He was a middle, and he kind of plateaued. His timing was all kind of screwy. I said, hey, let's just go goofy. For whatever reason, I have no idea why. I don't know idea what happens internally. He started kabooming balls. No idea why. No idea. But I had to, again, it's like, let's just vary it. Let's see what happens, right? So a lot of the time we get caught in these same modes of thought, right? Because we've all been doing this stuff for a long time. And I'm guilty of it too, right? I'm guilty of doing all this stuff, saying that there's a particular way to do it. And I'm still trying to unravel a lot of that stuff, right? And even today, right? We're in the sessions and I'm just asking questions to the athletes. You can hear people wanting to answer. You can hear Chris, oh, this is called the scoop. I'm like, don't tell them the answer. Stop giving them the answers, right? Because how do we as human beings learn? We learn by doing it. You tell us the answer, we don't learn, right? And so nowadays, what we become as coaches is designers of things, right? You have to become good designers of things. How do I design a drill where I don't have to say it, right? So we'll get into that in a second, but that's a huge part of where the coaching industry is at nowadays, at least at the edge of information. Okay, we talked about scap retraction. We don't have to talk about that anymore.
If you guys need to go because you want to leave.
Oh, yeah.
You're welcome to
Yeah,
do that whenever.
please do.
I'll just finish. And,
Yeah.
yeah.
When did we want to finish?
It's up to you. Like how much longer do you think you have?
I don't know. What time do you guys gotta go?
5.
Now?
Yeah, they gotta go
For about 6 hours.
Was a pleasure to meet you.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you
I
for
have
coming.
this too. I'm recording it for them
Okay.
so they can watch the end of it.
Okay.
You just go.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you.
See ya.
All right.